August 6, 1945, a single bomb drops on the city of Hiroshima. 100,000 people die and the world changes forever. The atomic age is born and ends the greatest bloodbath in history, World War II. At least 50 million people died in World War II, and it spawned terrible new engines of war. For the first time, man glimpsed self-annihilation and the ultimate evil, genocide.
From their graves.
But somehow this first global war saved us from more madness, and New Zealanders played their part in the struggle. 50 years on, they tell us what it was like when New Zealand was at war.
Nobody was really brave. We were all bloody frightened.
December 13, 1939. Deep in the South Atlantic, the German pocket battleship, the Admiral Graf Spee, is caught in a trap. 3 smaller ships, including New Zealand's Achilles, pound the Graf Spee's heavy armour. And the great ship of the German Navy is scuttled in Germany's first setback of the war.
The pocket battleship blazes in the channel, a funeral pyre for Hitler's dreams of sea power.
When the Achilles returns to Auckland, 100,000 turn out for an ecstatic celebration.
Returns. The men of a gallant ship are home.
But the celebration of the centennial continued.
It's a heroic gift for a country which is celebrating its first 100 years and has just chosen its national hymn.
People remembered a message broadcast by the now ailing Prime Minister.
Within months, the unthinkable will happen. Hitler's blitzkrieg will roll across Europe. And our kinfolk will be fighting desperately for their lives in the Battle of Britain. But back home, for the first 9 months, the phony war seems a good war. War helps our economic crisis. Unemployment disappears. We have our share of heroes. And the full horror of a Nazi war has yet to sink in. After they've crippled the Graf Spee, our boys go drinking and singing with her German crew in Buenos Aires. We really do think, oh, what a lovely war.
Stop thinking and follow me, cried Hitler. I will make you masters of the world.
Adolf Hitler was the evil genius who stirred the passions of the German peoples and ignited the world. He was a brilliant orator, a cunning and ruthless leader, and a lunatic racist with a hatred of Jews. He wanted the countries to the east. Russians, Poles, and other Slavs living there were Untermenschen, or subhuman, and if necessary, they would be exterminated. But to have the East, Hitler must first control the West. However, Hitler's rise goes back to World War I. Supposed to be the war to end all wars, the seeds of World War II were sown immediately after it.
Sow the dark creed of hatred.
While Europe disarmed, the first of the modern dictators came to power in 1922.
Became ridiculous.
The Italian dictator Benito Mussolini built a powerful military state on racist and nationalistic lines.
The treaty they sign is designed to give peace to Europe, freedom to...
Meanwhile, the Treaty of Versailles left Germany broke and humiliated. The ex-World War I Corporal Adolf Hitler called it a slave treaty. Then along came the Great World Depression of the late 20s. With 6 million unemployed and 20 million at starvation level, Germany was now in chaos.
The Nazis are deliberately causing trouble.
A perfect breeding ground for Nazi policies of hatred.
Supporting the Nazis. Can they avoid another revolution?
Adolf Hitler's time had come.
Adolf Hitler was born into a middle-class Austrian-Chow family in 1889. Young Adolf was a fun-loving boy until the death of his favorite brother seemed to darken his personality. A choir boy at a Benedictine monastery, he was struck by the way symbols and ritual moved people. A failed artist, Hitler was a corporal in the Kaiser's army during World War I and won decorations for bravery. In post-war Munich, Hitler formed the Nazi Party and began to cast a spell over a troubled people with a private army of thugs, bitter World War I veterans and fascists. Hitler blamed Germany's problems on Jews and Marxists. A religious symbol he remembered from the Benedictine monastery, the swastika, became the Nazi symbol. And the ritual of worship was turned into huge, brilliantly staged managed political rallies, which helped Hitler win power in 1933. The Germans had elected their Führer.
Heil, my soldiers!
Like Germany, New Zealand had left many dead on the battlefields of the Great War of 1914-18. 17,000 Kiwis died, an awful toll for a population of only 1 million. They'd done their bit for Britain, and now the war-weary vets just wanted to get on with their lives. Just as in Germany, the 20s were rough times in New Zealand, but the early 30s were worse. After Wall Street crashed, so did New Zealand. Our tiny rural economy was devastated. Unemployment soared. People went hungry.
And that was followed by riots in each of the four main centres, which expressed the extreme bitterness of the working class in New Zealand.
I remember Mum putting this plate under my nose and it was boiled pumpkin and onions. That's all there was.
It was disastrous time, it was really.
And I remember Mum had none, not because she didn't like it, it wasn't enough.
As the Depression worsened, the government floundered. As in Europe, the people turned to a charismatic leader. Unlike the Germans and Italians who chose men of war to lead them from their troubles, New Zealand's Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage was driven by humanism rather than hatred. Instead of the stiff-arm Nazi salute, our leader Savage was more inclined to a neighbourly Kiwi wave. Savage promised New Zealanders cradle-to-grave security.
Including health, education and general security.
Everywhere.
And Savage kept his word. Labour brought in the welfare state. It seemed to work.
I don't think that it had anything to do with the Labour Party or any other party, but New Zealand was coming out of the Depression. His approach, which was a gentle, compassionate approach, was a very successful one.
During New Zealand's recovery, Hitler's rantings attracted little attention.
It would be a favourite party piece if you ever had a party that someone would get up and put a comb up here and comb the hair down and imitate Hitler.
The King's abdication for an American divorcee was a far more serious matter.
The Duke of York succeeded his uncrowned brother.
People knew vaguely that there was a threat of aggression from Germany, which was the old enemy. But most people were too concerned with what was happening in their own lives.
At Nuremberg, the spiritual home of Nazi power, Adolf Hitler receives the cheers of adoring millions. He has restored prosperity and national pride. He has also armed Germany to the teeth, and her factories operate around the clock, producing aircraft and tanks, the weapons for quick victory. Hitler makes no secret of his plans. He will reunite all German-speaking peoples. The democracies believe Hitler does not want war. They are wrong. As soon as he is ready, he will take what he wants by force. August 6, 1936, and New Zealand's Jack Lovelock heads off in the mile at the Berlin Olympics. Lovelock takes the gold and sets a new world record in front of Adolf Hitler. New Zealanders are ecstatic. Few care that the Berlin Olympics are being used as a showcase of Aryan German might. By 1936, Hitler's persecution of German Jews was out in the open, and so were his territorial designs on his neighbours in Europe. As a nation, we had mixed feelings about the Germans, and we didn't really know what to make of Adolf Hitler. Few New Zealanders realised what Hitler's Germany was really like. But a young Geoffrey Cox had already seen the Nazis in action.
If the Nazis passed with a banner raised, all Germans went straight to the pavement and put out their arm like that until it went past. And I just stood on the pavement with my hands in my pockets. And immediately 2 or 3 chaps broke ranks and came at me. And the officer in charge signaled to one of these chaps, and He disappeared from sight, and the next thing I knew was that I was lying in the gutter, having had a great wallop on the head.
Japan has invaded Manchuria and wants Indochina.
And the other Prince of Darkness let loose his Black Legions.
Italy is fighting the Abyssinians in Africa.
There's a war on Abyssinia, won't you come? There's a war on Abyssinia, won't you come? Mussolini will be there shooting peanuts in the air. There's a war on Abyssinia, won't you come? Of course, it made a joke of what was a very serious and horrible business.
These are Hitler's weapons.
Meanwhile, Germany is battle-testing weapons and men in the Spanish Civil War. The Allies' response is to appease the aggressors.
They showed no disposition to resist the obvious aggression that Hitler was then embarking on.
As the world marches towards war, New Zealand is one of the few countries to speak out against aggression.
It isn't too late yet.
We're on the League of Nations, but the League's track record of dealing with aggression is poor.
Country and his people.
It was valuable for New Zealand to have demonstrated that it could do a bit of its own thinking in those meetings at Geneva.
Meanwhile, the lone voice of backbencher Winston Churchill was echoed by a brilliant Kiwi cartoonist, David Lowe. Lowe's mockery of Hitler's goose-stepping pretensions would put him on the Nazis' death list. But in David Lowe, Churchill had a like-minded ally.
We British can pat ourselves on the back for our cheerful outlook, even when facing the enemies of mankind.
Born in Dunedin, David Lowe became one of the best-known and highly paid cartoonists in the Empire.
Very much a Kiwi, highly individual man, a highly intelligent man and very thoughtful, marvellous sense of humour. The great quality of his cartoons was that they were very often very funny while making very powerful points.
His most famous character was Colonel Blimp, who represented the smug complacency of the British establishment.
Some people in this country...
Lowe's cartoons were syndicated worldwide, but in this rare footage he reviews Russian cartoons to show a rogues gallery of Nazi leaders to the British.
Some of the Nazi leaders. Well, you wouldn't guess this one, of course. This is Goering. And Himmler. Well, I seem to know that face. Dr. Goebbels, I presume. Here he's saying, I repeat, the true Aryan is always tall, upright, blue-eyed, fair-haired, and with a high forehead. Yes, indeed.
He was a very powerful force in reminding people that Hitler was a danger.
But dissenting voices like Lowe and Churchill ultimately amount to little. Hitler enters into a pact of steel with Mussolini. Later, Japan signs her support. All three countries continue war preparations. Meanwhile, the democracies of Britain and France agree to every demand the fascists make. First, Hitler occupies the Rhineland, which borders France. It is an outrageous bluff, and it succeeds. The French protest, but their huge army does nothing. The British refuse to take any initiative. This appeasement is a momentous mistake. Hitler now feels free to act as he pleases. Next on Hitler's shopping list is Austria, his birthplace.
Austria comes under the curse.
He delivers an ultimatum to the Austrian government. Turn over your country to Germany or risk all-out war.
A nation yields, a people awaits its fate.
Hitler drives triumphantly into Vienna. 6 months later, Hitler demands the return of 3 million Germans living in Czechoslovakia, and he prepares for a military takeover.
The world merely wonders where he will strike next.
Far more than any of the others, it had created a democracy, and that should be given away seemed to me a very bitter result.
Tension builds across Europe.
Chamberlain takes the dramatic step of flying to Germany in a last-minute effort to save the world from catastrophe.
At Berchtesgaden, he tries to find a peaceful way out of the crisis which Hitler's megalomania has precipitated.
I felt myself that Chamberlain was weak. I think most New Zealanders did at that time.
And Chamberlain, Daladier, Mussolini and Hitler signed the agreement. There were some at the time who complained bitterly that Czechoslovakia was deserted by her allies.
The Czechs have no say in their future. At Munich, Britain and France betray them. The world rejoiced at peace, but not everyone was happy.
Britain and France had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor. They will have war.
What they should have done, of course, is shot Hitler long before 1933.
And David Lowe's verdict drew an official protest from Berlin.
Yes, David Lowe was on a list of 120 names, I think, of people who were marked down to be immediately eliminated. And this was partly because the Nazis could not stand him mocking Hitler.
15th of March, Germany strikes. Not at Poland, but at the remainder of Czechoslovakia.
The rape of Czechoslovakia means the end of appeasement. Western governments now face war. And German industry has produced a superb war machine. The Allies speed up their war preparations, but they know it will take years before their military strength is superior to Germany's. Reluctantly, the New Zealand government jump-starts rearmament. Our military resources have been run down for years. What little money we had went to help build Britain's naval base in Singapore. It was the cornerstone of our defence. The German Air Force had state-of-the-art Messerschmitt 109s. We had ancient biplanes. Germany had a modern navy and more than 50 submarines. We had 2 light cruisers on loan from Britain. Germany had an army of 3.5 million men. In 1939, New Zealand had fewer than 600 soldiers. But closer to home, Japan was another problem. Japan's military government was also committed to massive rearmament. And her savage and brutal takeover of China prompted fears about Tokyo's intentions in the Pacific. In New Zealand, defending our long coastline was the obvious priority. The Air Force orders 30 Wellington bombers from Britain for coastal defence. Our tiny navy patrols local waters. A large recruiting campaign starts, sponsored by Prime Minister Savage. He asks for 100,000 men. He gets 16,000.
A lot of these people joined the territorials in the Depression days because they got issued with a rifle, a .303, and boots.
I always wanted to join the army. I always wanted to go to war and always wanted to win medals. Seems stupid, doesn't it?
There was intensive training for every man who could carry a rifle.
Meanwhile, Savage has a problem. The prosperous welfare state he's promised us is at risk because we're going broke. So as war looms, Finance Minister Walter Nash rushes to Europe to beg for money from British bankers.
New Zealand's contribution to imperial defence.
August 1939. Hitler is demanding more Lebensraum, this time from Poland. Walter Nash gets his loan and heads for home, worrying about our ability to repay it. But he knows if war breaks out, we'll be fine because the British will take our food.
War was good in as much that there was a ready market for everything that New Zealand produced.
Nash arrives back on September 5, 1939. Our economy and the welfare state is saved. The British want to buy our food. World War II is already 48 hours old. September 1, 1939. 5 of Hitler's armies roll into Poland. The German Navy opens fire. The Luftwaffe dive bombs Polish towns and cities. This is Blitzkrieg, a terrible new form of warfare, and Poland is the first to experience it.
It was a combination of the power of the air, the shatter attack of armor, combined with an infantry assault.
Blitzkrieg means lightning war. To succeed, Blitzkrieg uses surprise, speed, and Schrecklichkeit. Surprise comes through invading Poland without warning. Speed enables German panzers to penetrate deep inside Poland fast. Schrecklichkeit is the cold-blooded decision to attack towns and villages. This produces terror. Panic-stricken civilians flee to the country.
Their new warfare style was to send their bombers ahead and bomb the villages, and especially refugees, to serve the purpose of choking the roads, intimidating the public, and the morale of the nation is badly affected by that.
And they struck.
Germany's invasion of Poland stunned the West. After all, Poland was an ally. On paper, their combined military strength was a match for Hitler. The French had a huge army. The British had the largest navy in the world. But Hitler gambled the West would not go to war to defend Poland, and he cunningly sidelined Russia to the east by forming an unholy alliance with Joseph Stalin. Then he attacked Poland. At this stage, a decisive Allied attack could have changed the outcome of the entire war. Hitler had left his western front exposed without tanks or planes and only 3 days' ammunition. The Poles begged for support, but the Allies dithered. Finally, with Poland in ruins, London and Paris sent Berlin an ultimatum: withdraw by Sunday the 3rd of September or war begins. Back in New Zealand, the Cabinet prepares to do something no New Zealand government has ever done before: declare war. At 9:30 p.m. on Sunday evening, the British ultimatum to Germany expires. Britain is now at war with Germany, and so are we.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street.
At 9:45 p.m, New Zealand listens to the radio while the British Prime Minister addresses the Empire.
And that consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
There are mixed feelings about war, in contrast with the enthusiasm of 1914.
Because everybody visualised that the war would become like the war in Flanders, a great war of attrition where thousands were going to die in the mud.
We had an annual challenge with a team up the Bay of Plenty at Rokorkore.
We started playing war games almost immediately.
So it was a toss-up whether we carry on to Rokorkore, which isn't very far from Takara, or come back to join up.
And then we had to be Germans and they were the British, and we'd have mock battles in the playground.
We decided on the game of football first and then the war afterwards.
From his sickbed, Prime Minister Savage talks to the nation.
We range ourselves without fear beside Britain. Where she goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand.
At sea on manoeuvres, sailors from the Achilles receive a telegram.
And that's when things altered dramatically. You darkened the ship and you started zigzagging.
At home, there's little opposition to the government decision, a handful of pacifists and a tiny communist party.
There was a need to kill Germans, whether it was murder or not, to win the war. And I went into the war believing that fervently.
New Zealand will contribute 138,000 men to our army, 8% of the population.
Our chaps were very good. I'm open to debate that there are others as good, but I don't think there were many better.
25% of the male population will serve abroad in one uniform or another.
Suddenly, Marston was denuded of their, what I called their prime youth. It just seemed terrible.
There'll be 36,000 New Zealand casualties. 12,000 will die.
You can smell death there. It's a really horrible smell. It smells like rotten pork, I think.
Part of a whole generation will wake up screaming in the night for the rest of their lives.
The old nervous system took a bit of a hammering. I've survived it. I think I'm on top of it, but it's taken me a long time.
But at first, war makes little impact. When a trigger-happy gunner fires at a British freighter by mistake, it's our first shot of the war. Our immediate plan is to support Britain. The Air Force loans its 30 new coastal bombers straight back to the RAF. The Navy's 2 cruisers fall under Royal Navy control. Leander guards local waters, Achilles protects our Pacific trade routes. And after Japan declares neutrality, our government agrees a New Zealand army will fight overseas for Britain.
Yes, well, that partly went for King and Country. Because I think we had a lot of loyalties in those days.
When you came from Palmerston North, as I did, which is the most landlocked, boring place there ever can be, it was the great thrill.
All of a sudden, the world is opened up to you only if you were joined up.
I got a telegram from my father. He was a Boer War veteran and said, do your duty and sign up. And then it was, I'd been 6 weeks in Burnham when I got a little parcel through the mail So I opened it up and it was 3 stripes and with sew these on. My father's Boer War, 3 stripes. All he thought you had to do is pin them on and you had them.
6,000 men enlist on the first day. Within a week, 36,000.
They very soon, and I was surprised how quickly they did become soldierly chaps.
But our military thinking is out of date. Our army believes its immediate task is to train civilians for fighting in French trenches like we'd done in World War I.
But what saved the bacon of the army was the fact that we had the TF, Territorial Force, of about 10,000, of whom about half, maybe, not quite half, were pretty efficient. It had enough training to know something really about soldiering.
Eventually, the New Zealanders would establish themselves as some of the best soldiers of the war, but ours was always a civilian army. Thousands joined up, did their bit, and left, if they got out alive. One of our most famous battalions was the 28th, better known as the Māori Battalion.
During World War I, there were fears the Māori population was near extinction, and Māori were exempted from service. This time, Māori demanded to fight, and 900 immediately volunteered. 28th Battalion was exclusively Māori, although many of its officers were Pākehā. Most 28th Battalion volunteers came from 3 tribes: the Ngāpuhi of Northland, Arawa from the Bay of Plenty, Ngāti Porou of the East Coast.
It took the whole of the Waikato, Wairarapa, Hawke's Bay and the South Island to make up an equivalent to the others in numbers. You can see where the good land was and where all the park intermarriage went on. Well, I was part of D Company. We were called the Ngāti Walkabout.
Many young Māori were so keen to join, they reverted to the use of their ancestral names in order to sign up underage.
There were 2 brothers, Pinky and Adam, we used to call them. One was only 14 and the other was 15. And they got away. And unfortunately, again, neither of those 2 boys came back.
Campaigns, they swing along to their own song, Māori Battalion. Battalion, not too glory, take the honor of the people where you.
The Māori Battalion song became one of the great themes of the war. The Māori Battalion would become one of our most spirited body of fighting men and strike great fear among our foes.
Well, even now, it's hard for me to imagine anybody not joining up.
By late September, 14,000 New Zealanders had enlisted to fight in Europe. Within a month, Poland ceased to exist. Her soldiers were no match for Hitler's armies. Neither Britain nor France had honoured their promise to help, and Germany and Russia divided Poland between them.
They introduced their order.
The Gestapo and SS unleashed unprecedented brutality on Poland's huge Jewish population. And at a place called Auschwitz, a nightmare begins which will one day horrify the world. Friday, October 13, 1939. German sub U-47 submerges near Scapa Flow, base of the Royal Navy's Home Fleet in Scotland. In London, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill sounds a warning.
One must expect a violent reaction from Herr Hitler. Perhaps quite soon.
The U-47 surfaces and squeezes through the tiny gap in the entrance to Scapa Flow. Ahead lies the great World War I battleship Royal Oak. On board, a crew of 1,200. U-47 fires off her torpedoes, and in 13 minutes the Royal Oak sinks. Only 400 survive. U-47 escapes and receives a hero's welcome in Germany. Her captain is awarded the Knight's Cross. A furious Churchill demands revenge. That revenge will be partly administered by a small New Zealand ship in her first battle.
Battle of the Atlantic has never been.
Hitler's submarine wolf packs will soon threaten Britain's supply lifelines, but on the rich South Atlantic trade routes, the threat was not U-boats. Hitler had a surprise new weapon, a marauding pocket battleship, the Graf Spee. In November, New Zealand's light cruiser Achilles altered course for the South Atlantic and a showdown with the Graf Spee.
Achilles is the pride of the New Zealand Navy. On loan from the British, she's our most sophisticated warship. A Leander-class light cruiser, Achilles is a tenth of the size of a full battleship and only half the size of the Graf Spee. Just 6 years old, she has a top speed of 32 knots, 8 6-inch guns, 2 torpedo tubes, and a seaplane.
Years later, I said to my wife, the best home I ever had. And the wife bit like a shark. She said, was it better than this one? And I had to say, well, equal.
In the early 30s, Hitler gave orders to rebuild the German Navy. The yards at Kiel and Bremen secretly produced over 40 warships and 50 submarines. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden to build ships over a certain size. The German counter to this was a brilliant new vessel, the Panzerschiff, the pocket battleship, a small supership. They had an enormous range, a top speed of 26 knots, and a massive armor-plated hull. Among Hitler's great new ships was the Admiral Graf Spee.
She carried 11-inch guns. Now that's twice the size of our guns.
Langsdorff is to end his own life.
Her master, Captain Hans Langsdorff, was an anti-Nazi. In 2 months at sea, the Spee sank 9 ships without taking a single life.
The 100th day of the war, Thursday, December 13, 240 miles off the coast of Uruguay. The Achilles has been sailing with 2 other Royal Navy cruisers, Exeter and Ajax, when she receives a message.
In the event of meeting an enemy ship, Exeter will turn off 45 degrees. Ajax and Achilles will remain in company, and we will engage her from 2 different angles to divide her fire.
For Bully Martinson from Waihi, the signaller aboard Achilles, this day will never be forgotten. Bully is about to make New Zealand naval history. The Spee's captain, Langsdorff, disobeys Hitler's instructions not to tangle with enemy warships. He has misjudged the size of the enemy. Lookouts have shown the mastheads of only 1 British ship. Unaware of his error, Langsdorff opens fire.
And there were these spouts of water, about a couple 100 feet high. I knew they shouldn't have been there.
And signaller Bully Martinson asks his English skipper, Captain Parry, if he can fly a Kiwi battle flag for the first time.
So I said, we know we're going into action. Whether we'll float or sink is another matter. Why can't we fly the New Zealand incident domain? And he looked at me and he said, put the biggest one up you got. Well, I went down and hoisted this, and it was with great pride. Beautiful sight. And I'll never forget it.
Achilles fired about 200 broadsides.
We were getting some damn good hits in, and she was firing at us, and we were zigzagging all the time to confuse the range. It was, I might say, not frightening, it was thrilling. The heat was tremendous. We were firing a broadside about every 7 seconds. Now that's one hell of a thing.
If you worked it out on paper, they should have blown us sky high.
Yeah, the shots as far as the shells are concerned were practically useless on that ship unless we got in close.
We got within about 3 miles, which is very, very close indeed.
The 11-inch guns of the Graf Spee, she trained on the Exeter, and too much firepower just knocked her out quick, which left us 2, and we're like 2 little terriers chasing a big dog.
We're firing torpedoes at her, and she didn't like that. 11-inch shell burst close to the Achilles, and the splinters killed 4 men there.
Well, they didn't want the bodies there, and they were badly shattered, torn to pieces. They just chucked them over the side and onto the flag deck. That's all he said. Sorry to have bothered you. He was dead. 16. That's the day men were men and women were double-breasted.
One of the wounded was Bully Martinson, who lost a leg to the Spee's 11-inch shell and was comforted with a huge tot of rum.
After I'd had that tot of rum, I was ready for the work.
Limping into the harbor of Montevideo in Uruguay comes the German pocket battleship Graf Spee to bind the wounds he received in combat.
The Achilles and the Ajax waited outside the harbour, but Uruguay's strict neutrality laws allow the Spee only 72 hours stopover.
But 36 of their comrades rest in simple pine boxes draped with swastikas.
Langsdorff just has time to bury his dead, and so does the Achilles.
Would the Graf Spee go to sea and fight, or would she surrender? The captain of the Graf Spee, Hans Langsdorff, alone would decide.
On Sunday, December 17, huge crowds gathered in Montevideo to watch the Graf Spee depart. They expected a great naval battle because the Royal Navy's ships were known to be waiting outside the harbour entrance.
And then propaganda took over, and they were putting over that the whole British fleet had arrived, was waiting outside the harbour entrance.
It was a hoax, and the Germans bought it.
She's headed seaward.
At news of the Spee's departure, the small ships prepared for action. But the Spee never made it to battle.
Captain Langsdorff leaves most of his crew behind and sails from port to scuttle his once proud ship rather than let it fall into victorious British hands. With her skeleton crew safely in lifeboats, the pocket battleship blazes in the channel, a funeral pyre for Hitler's dreams of sea power.
I thought, well, what a darn waste. It was a beautiful ship.
Achilles has little time to celebrate and heads to a British hospital in the Falkland Islands. Bully Martinson is delirious with his injuries when he learns his oldest daughter Joan has died in New Zealand. The war is over for Bully, and also the Spee's crew. His skipper Langsdorff shoots himself wrapped in the Imperial German flag. Finally, Achilles arrives in Buenos Aires. A surprise awaits the New Zealanders.
But as we walked in, the music stopped dead. Everybody walked off the floor. So what happened here? We asked him. He said, tears running down his cheeks almost. He said, this Center, German Community, Buenos Aires.
The crew of the Graf Spee were also in Buenos Aires.
For they are to be interned in Argentina.
So he said, come over and we'll shake hands with them. So I said, well, it won't do any harm. Only harm will do if they refuse to shake hands with us. So we went over and offered our hands, and they stood up and shook hands with us.
There is an international language of the sea, you might say, of sailormen.
Immediately there was loud applause from the crowd, and the band started up again.
But while the Achilles crew drink with the honourable Germans in Buenos Aires, back in conquered Poland, there is no war with honour.
Hatred of Jews was not something Adolf Hitler invented. In pre-war Vienna, where Hitler lived, open anti-Semitism flourished. His bestseller, Mein Kampf, reveals a man obsessed by what he called the putrid smells and contamination of Jews. And most Germans, long accustomed to Europe's anti-Semitic history, easily accepted his views.
First World had been caused by Jews. The Depression had been caused by Jews. Their misery and their deprivation and their everything had been caused by Jews. So what do you do to get better? You get rid of the Jews. And this was the groundwork for the final solution.
German persecution of the Jews was about to turn into genocide. Meanwhile, in Auckland, 100,000 people lined the streets to welcome home their heroes.
When we got back and saw the people giving us the welcome, well, we realised then it was something big, and it was.
The war has reached its 7th month, and so far, after New Zealand's first official fighting action, the death toll is just 4, casualties 7. For us, it's still a case of, oh, what a lovely war.
No, they were good days, and I wouldn't mind living them again, just quietly. No, they were good days.
Swing sending exports to Britain.
All round, it's pretty good.
Even the weather was perfect, a golden summer while Europe froze. We'd finally agreed on a national hymn, and we farewelled our first troops overseas for training in Egypt.
There was high hilarity on that wharf. It shouldn't have been, but the boys were throwing their buttons off down to us below and hats off and calling out to Freiburg, who went with them on that ferry. And they were calling out to him, hurry up, we're all, hurry up, Tiny, calling him Tiny.
At home, people got engaged. They got married and they had babies. Lots of babies. 9 months after war was declared, the birth rate doubled.
April 1940. The man who promised social welfare from the cradle has gone to his grave. Michael Joseph Savage is dead. This is the worst news of our war so far. His decision to commit New Zealand to war severely troubled him. He couldn't watch the first echelon sail. 200,000 lined the route to Bastion Point. And as the lights went out in Europe, New Zealand lost its beloved leader.
I can remember his funeral, sitting by the radio and listening to the funeral being described and the sadness that went along with it. And it was quite a loss to the country.
It's spring and the Germans move fast. 4 days after Neville Chamberlain told his colleagues Hitler has missed the bus, Germany attacked. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland. France is crushed in 6 weeks.
We just wondered what was going to happen. Our great faith was the Maginot Line, because that was impenetrable, so we were told.
The fall of Norway was the downfall of Neville Chamberlain.
Took power in Britain under Winston Churchill.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
But Churchill could do nothing to stop Hitler now. On May 10, German paratroopers rained down on Holland. German Stukas dive-bombed Belgium. German panzers sneaked around the impregnable Maginot Line and into France. Over the next few days, Hitler conquered Europe.
We didn't expect them to come through with such speed. We thought the French would hold them up somewhere. They had over 100 divisions.
The Allies now faced the full power of the Luftwaffe.
And they had 1,000 front-line aeroplanes there, fighters and bombers, who were experienced.
In 72 hours, the British lost half their bombers. Fighter casualties were the heaviest ever recorded. And as soon as word came of the German invasion, Cobber Kane was in the sky. By 6:30 a.m., he had destroyed an enemy bomber, the beginning of an extraordinary sequence of kills. In the next 10 days, Cobber shot down 12 aircraft. And as France crumbled, other young Kiwi flyers were blooded in the skies over Dunkirk.
We didn't know what to expect, but of course, we certainly didn't expect Dunkirk.
Almost the entire British army was trapped.
It was just chaos. There were bodies everywhere, but there were loads of little boats.
While this remarkable armada ferried soldiers back to England, the Luftwaffe tormented the retreat.
Of course, we were very excited about this and just thought, well, we'll show them, you know.
Al Dare was a most remarkable character. He had 9 lives. I think he burnt up about 8 of them. He was a most remarkable character, very warm-hearted, incredibly brave.
And we were flying over the bridgehead, and somebody shouted 109s. Well, you've never seen 12 pilots move so quickly all your life. We broke in all directions.
Dunkirk cost the RAF many planes and men. 44 New Zealanders were among those killed.
Straighten up and fly right. Cool down, Papa, don't you blow your top.
Friday, June 7. RAF squadrons are withdrawing from France. Cobber Kane prepares for his departure. Exhausted, he's just shot down his 17th kill of the war. He is 21. Ever the entertainer, Cobber shows off.
Straighten up and fly right. Straighten up and fly right.
Fiancée of Flight Lieutenant Cobber Kane, DFC, New Zealand Air Ace, who was killed recently, Miss Joyce Phillips presents the colours to the 174th Squadron of Air Cadets at Bellevue, Manchester. This is a ceremony which Cobber was to perform himself. Now the colours are dedicated to his memory. The thousands come to see this presentation by a very courageous girl who wears pinned to her coat the little Maori mascot which Cobber wore on all his flights.
We're proud of Cobber's exploits and his efforts, but I've often wished that I had a live brother rather than a dead hero. That
Auf den Eiffelturm. Links vom Führer Professor Speer. Paris ist in deutscher Hand.
To Hitler's great satisfaction, France signs her armistice with Germany in the same railway carriage where Germany surrendered after World War I. It is June the 22nd, 1940.
In the spring of 1940, Hitler met Mussolini at the Brenner Pass.
In the last few days, an opportunistic Italy joins in on Germany's side. Britain stands alone in Europe. The New Zealand Expeditionary Force, which always expected to fight in France, now finds itself scattered between New Zealand, Britain and Egypt. The new Prime Minister, Peter Fraser, gives the government extreme new powers in the national interest. Labour introduces conscription.
They have been trained hard to fight hard.
Meanwhile, with France crushed, Hitler expects Britain to surrender. But Hitler has misjudged Churchill and the British.
The Battle of Britain is about to begin. But if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Finally, Hitler issues orders for invasion. Britain is now fighting for her life.
Britain must become an impregnable citadel of free people.
18 days after the fall of France, Britain's worst fears come true.
My recollections of the summer of 1940 is of some of the most ecstatic moments of my life. There was a sense in the whole country of a combination of determination and excitement and purpose.
From Germany's new captured bases in France and Belgium, Luftwaffe Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring orders his planes into the air. From his RAF control headquarters in Uxbridge near London, an obscure New Zealander from Thames and the Coromandel receives news of the German flight path. For Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, the Battle of Britain has begun.
A hero of Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain.
Running a war is always a clash of wills, and Keith Park is one of the strongest personalities and fighters in the RAF.
He was more or less God.
A hands-on leader. At Dunkirk, Park logged 100 hours in his Hurricane studying German tactics. Park volunteered for World War I and was a courageous soldier at Gallipoli in the Somme. But he was so severely wounded in the trenches, he had to switch to the RAF, where he became a fighter ace and captain a squadron. By 1938, he was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's right-hand man. Together they planned the defence of Britain. The summer of 1940 was their test. Dowding controls the battle day to day. Keith Park will control it hour to hour.
I remember Keith Park as being a man that the fighter pilots all had tremendous respect for, and tremendous admiration for, and tremendous confidence in.
Park will have responsibility for 11 Group, the most important group. It includes London. 11 Group will decide the Battle of Britain.
11 Group was in the southeast, and that's where they knew most of the attacking was going to come from.
Keith Park is an expert in fighter interception, a brilliant strategist and cool in a crisis.
And he didn't care whose toes he trod on.
He has influential enemies within the RAF hierarchy, including a rival group commander, Trafford Lee Mallory, who wants to run 11 Group. During the battle, Park overrules them, but at his greatest moment, they'll cut him down.
The Luftwaffe has a huge reputation and a bigger air force. 1,000 fighters, 1,300 bombers.
We knew they had a hellish big air force. We knew it was a damn sight bigger than ours.
But Dowding's revitalised his fighters in the months since Dunkirk and now has 650 Hurricanes and Spitfires to defend Britain. And a new weapon, radar, will allow Dowding to manoeuvre his small forces with precision against the enemy.
The Spitfire was the RAF's top combat aircraft.
One of the most beautiful planes ever built, and a lovely thing to fly.
It had a top speed of 362 miles per hour, thanks to its 1,000 horsepower Rolls-Royce engine and sleek aerodynamics. Pilots preferred the Spitfire to the Hurricane.
If you got into major difficulties with Germans on your tail, you pulled the stick hard back, kicked the rudder on, and went into a vertical spin. Now, if you weren't quite sure how to get out of it, I think if you simply left it all alone, it would fly itself out.
However, the workhorse of the RAF was the sturdy Hawker Hurricane, and it was the Hurricane which destroyed 80% of the Luftwaffe's aircraft.
In the first phase of the battle, the Luftwaffe targeted British harbours and convoys in the English Channel and sent massive fighter sweeps over southern England, 11 Group territory. Goering hoped to lure the RAF fighters into an early, decisive fight. Keith Park saw through it. An aggressive fighter by nature, his response was cautious. He kept fighter-to-fighter combat to a minimum.
Because we were always outnumbered. So we were more or less on a hit-and-run basis.
Even so, the RAF lost 80 top pilots and 120 aircraft.
Losing fellow pilots you had to accept it as an inevitable factor. It's rather like a game of cricket. So some go in and they can make a duck, and others make a few runs.
Park knew at that rate of destruction, the RAF was doomed within 6 weeks.
Each time we got into combat with them, we lost one or two chaps, and so it went on.
And the main Luftwaffe assault had yet to begin.
The Luftwaffe had proved itself in combat many times, especially in the Spanish Civil War and the Blitzkrieg campaigns. The star was the Messerschmitt 109. The Messerschmitt was a deadly rival for the Spitfire and superior at altitudes of 20,000 feet or higher. It had an 1150 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine and a maximum speed of 357 miles per hour. Germany had 4 bombers, the Junkers 88, the Junkers 87 Stuka dive bomber, the Dornier 17Z, and the Heinkel 111. The Heinkel was comparatively slow and easy meat for prowling fighters.
By mid-August, death and exhaustion had ravaged the RAF, but it was still flying. The Luftwaffe changed tactics. Goering, a former heroin addict with an enormous ego and a penchant for gaudy uniforms, promised Hitler the RAF would be destroyed in 4 days. The first of the Luftwaffe's heavy daylight raids against radar, ports and RAF airfields was launched on August 13.
They gave us the takeoff warning too late, and as we took off, the German bombs were falling all around us.
A massive second raid took place on August 15 as Goering attacked with nearly every plane he had.
You couldn't see anything but aircraft. Big chaps below and smaller chaps up the top, and relentlessly going forward.
At its peak, the line of aircraft was 20 miles long, 10 miles wide. The offensive continued for over a week. Casualties were heavy.
Well, it was terribly horrifying because it was the first experience of real war. And shooting going on everywhere, things blowing up.
The Luftwaffe never let up. Each time the RAF met them in smaller numbers. Yet mostly the RAF inflicted the greater losses. The New Zealanders earned great reputations.
New Zealanders shot down Messerschmitts over the Dover coast.
Goering now realised he must pulverise the RAF's vital nerve centres to win. He attacked Keith Park's airfields and aircraft factories.
We were caught by the bombs as they were falling. And a bomb dropped immediately in front of me and blew me sky high.
11 Group took a real battering.
And when you're hanging upside down in the cockpit, having lost your engine and all the petrol's flying out and the bombs are dropping all around, that was a pretty low ebb, I tell you.
The steamroller tactics hurt. The RAF was turning out 65 inexperienced pilots a week, and Park was losing nearly 100 each week.
Remember, our average age in fighter command as it went on for the Battle of Britain was 20.
We had a week, learned to fly the aeroplane and do some tactics. And that was it. You're on your way.
The tension of the battle was felt by all pilots.
When I was frightened, I said, "Please, God, look after me."
It was fear mixed with excitement.
Your heart took a few leaps and you felt a bit sick. But by the time you were running off to the cockpit and got in the cockpit, you were all right.
But we took it very philosophically. You'd say, well, by bad luck, poor old so-and-so's had it. By Jove's, I think his overcoat would fit me.
By the end of August, the battle reached its most crucial phase. The strain on 11 Group was intolerable.
And we just said to each other in the end, Christ, they've got to give us a rest. We can't go on.
A new problem now occurred, LMF, or lack of moral fibre.
Pilots got to a certain stage operationally when they just didn't have the willpower to push them through the barrier of going on fighting. Bravery really is a much overrated word. Nobody was really brave. We were all bloody frightened.
By now, a fighter pilot's life expectancy was just 87 hours.
And there was nobody in the mess and nobody in the bar except the barman. And we said, you know, where are all the guys? And he said, well, haven't you heard? They said, the whole squadron was shot down yesterday except one.
At this critical moment, Park faced great pressure from 12 Group's commander Lee Mallory to throw everything at the Germans. Park knew this big wing strategy was too risky. If his fighters were committed prematurely and lost, then so was the war.
If Lee Mallory had his way, he'd have committed the whole blooming lot. But I think Keith Parks knew exactly what he was doing, and I think he did it extremely well.
Saturday, September 7. A strange day because there is no Luftwaffe. But at 5 p.m. the sky fills with German planes. This time they're not heading for Park's airfields. Waves of planes bomb London, causing terrible damage. Keith Park realizes Goering has made a big mistake. By bombing London to please Hitler, instead of delivering the final blow to British airfields, he has thrown the RAF a lifeline. The time to recover. For a week, the Germans blitzed London. Civilians went underground as their city fell apart.
Yes, England can take it.
The RAF's defences were ineffective. German victory seemed near. Goering believed one more battle would do it for Germany. But there was still fight left in the RAF simply because Park and Dowding had refused to adopt the so-called big wing strategy.
As well as the Luftwaffe, Keith Park faced one other great problem during the Battle of Britain. A rival group commander, Trafford Lee Mallory. The vain, self-opinionated commander of 12 Group had crossed swords with Park earlier.
I think the general feeling was that he, in comparison with Parks, he was an incompetent leader.
He was a bit pompous, I thought, and I think most of us thought. And there's no question about it, he had the air of the people at the top.
Lee Mallory and his aggressive star pilot Douglas Bader favoured big wings, forces of at least 3 squadrons to slug it out with the Germans.
Before he left the continent.
Park longed to take on the Luftwaffe with his full force, but he and Dowding knew the RAF must always live to fight another day. Lee Mallory sulked.
A certain amount of Lee Mallory's animosity towards Keith Park was caused because he was rather jealous that he had been the number 1 and now he was the number 2 when it came to the actual battle.
In the Battle of Britain, Park found Big Wing too slow to assemble.
The first 2 examples of it, they didn't defend our airfields. Our airfields got horribly plastered and destroyed because they were about 17 minutes late.
The last great air battle of the campaign is minutes away. Invasion is expected any hour.
Those of us that were operating over the Low Countries were expecting it any day because every port was chock-a-block with barges, quite large barges, you know, and they were obviously being got ready to shift troops.
Just before 11 a.m, Winston Churchill arrives at Park's headquarters to observe. Park tells him not to smoke. The RAF are unrecognisable from a week earlier. This time they're ready and waiting for the Germans. Standing patrols have been up since dawn. At 10:55 a.m, Keith Park readies all squadrons. 100 of his Spitfires and Hurricanes meet the first wave of German bombers and fighters.
The aerial vanguard of the Nazis lay a twisted mass of metal on our shores.
The bombers were easy. They would go down very easily. But they wouldn't get quite so many fighters.
The depleted bombers struggle on to London, where they meet a head-on attack by Hurricanes. For the next hour, the action is continuous from London to the Channel. Churchill asks Park what reserves are available. None, he replies. By 12:30, the Germans have retreated. London escapes unharmed. But at 2 p.m, the Luftwaffe returns in force. 3 waves of bombers drone in. Again, Park's fighters are waiting. They're supported by planes from 10 and 12 Group. At last, Keith Park gives the command he's so patiently resisted for weeks, and the all-out fighter battle begins. In the action, the German bombers are badly mauled. Haphazardly, they eject their bombs and run for home. The Luftwaffe lose 60 aircraft, Fighter Command just 26. Goering's attempt to gain air superiority has failed. In 3 months, the RAF has lost 900 fighters, but they have shot down over 1,700 Luftwaffe aircraft.
If we hadn't been able to hold out, and that's all it amounted to, we didn't actually beat the Germans. We just held out long enough to make them give up their plans of invasion.
It is now too late for another major attack in 1940. The tides and weather are against the Germans. Invasion is impossible. The Battle of Britain is over. Of the 3,000 men who fought in the Battle of Britain, New Zealand provided the largest Commonwealth contingent with 129. 520 fighter pilots died in the battle. 20 were New Zealanders.
Well, the press made us glamorous, really. I don't think we're any different, I'm sure we weren't, from the bomber chaps.
In the summer of 1940 at Dunkirk and then over England, Alan Deer destroyed 17 enemy aircraft. But Colin Gray, a shepherd from Napier, was our top fighter ace of the Battle of Britain with 15 kills.
I enjoyed the lifestyle of the fighter squadron. I enjoyed the camaraderie, I enjoyed the spirit of it. The casualties didn't trouble me until later.
For New Zealand's Battle of Britain pilots, the end of fighting means a well-earned rest. But their actions are a sign of things to come, for thousands of New Zealand airmen will make a great and sometimes under-recognised contribution to the war.
And of course among the younger men there were many aces whose names were becoming known, even if their faces were less familiar. Such men as Colin Gray, Alan Deer, Johnny Checketts, Crawford Compton and Des Scott.
11,000 New Zealand airmen will serve in other major campaigns in Europe, the desert and the Far East. 7 New Zealand squadrons will form within the RAF, including the most famous of all, 75 Squadron.
New Zealand Squadron was always there when bombing history was being made.
The first Commonwealth Squadron. Many will earn great reputations. Some will perform heroic deeds. 3 will win the highest award for bravery, the Victoria Cross. And in New Zealand and the Pacific, more than 30,000 men will serve with our Air Force, the RNZAF.
Who already proved they can lick the Jap in the air, and they're out to keep on licking him.
In the meantime, despite his victory, the Battle of Britain is a personal defeat for Keith Park.
Keith Parks was definitely the man who won the Battle of Britain, and it was obvious that his tactics were the only practical tactics that we could use that would be successful.
On October 17, Keith Park and other group commanders were called to a meeting at the Air Ministry to review RAF tactics during the battle. Instead of commendation for winning the battle, Dowding and Park faced a proxy trial.
The RAF hierarchy, I think, gave Sir Keith Park a very bad deal. No question about that.
Lee Mallory had the numbers.
He knew the right people. And don't let's forget Park was a colonial.
Lee Mallory criticised Park and once again pushed his own big wing theory. Within weeks, the men who had won the Battle of Britain were out of their jobs.
At the time that Parks was dumped at the end of the Battle of Britain, we were absolutely shocked.
Sir Keith Park never achieved the rank that he should have done.
Dowding was sent to the United States. Park was put in charge of training. 11 Group had a new commander, Trafford Leigh-Mallory.
It was a terrible thing to do to a man who'd achieved such wonderful results in saving Britain.
But this was not the end of Keith Park. His next major command would be another desperate defence, Malta.
Underneath the arches, we dream a dream.
Christmas Day, 1940, and the war's not over. Britain is now alone in Europe. Japan is stirring in the east, and New Zealand's civilian army is readying for war. But the Kiwis are destined to meet Hitler's toughest troops in Greece, Crete, and the desert. Oh, What a Lovely War is about to turn into a bloody shambles.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run?
New Zealand at War continues.